thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Stephen Newton. I'm a Programs and Policy Director with the nonprofit organization, the National Center for Science Education. And what NCSE does is defend the teaching of evolution and climate change in public schools. We've recently added climate change for about almost 30 years. We've been doing the just evolution alone in public schools. And I'd like to talk to you today about some of the current things that are going on in the world of creationism, in the world of attacks on evolution. I'd like to talk about things that are happening, in fact, this week in legislatures around the country, and also about what may happen in the future and things that we can do about these attacks on evolution. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about NCSE, my nonprofit organization, and I'd like to talk then about the current issues and the roots of the problems and wind up with some of the solutions that we might have for these issues. NCSE is a 501c3 nonprofit, and why I keep saying that is that we rely on memberships and donations. But NCSE does a lot of different things in our mission of defending evolution and climate change. One thing we do is we travel to school boards. Here we see my boss, Dr. Eugenie Scott, standing with fellow pro-science activists in Austin, Texas, for the state school board in 2009. We've heard had a lot of mischief going on with the science standards. And my boss testified, as did many other scientists, to help organize and bring people who support evolution out to tell the Texas State Board of Education why what they were doing to the science standards was bad for science and bad for education. We proactively go out and teach evolution. Here we see one of my colleagues, Josh Rosenau, going through a phylogenetic tree with a bunch of children. This is something we did at the USA Science and Engineering Festival, which is held in Washington, D.C. We designed these phylogenetic trees you see here from scratch, and we had an artist make these pictures. I don't show quite that well there. But we had this artist make these pictures and then had little children go through and see how it is we are related to monkeys, how it is we are related to fish, how it is we are related to everything else on the planet. And children, we processed thousands of children through our booth in the first couple of days at the USA Science Festival, and it was a big hit. Children, I think, left that experience understanding how we are all descended from common ancestors with modifications. In other words, what evolution is all about. Now, what's happening currently in the world of creationism and evolution? Just to give you a sample of some of the things NCSE comes across. Every once in a while we will get a parent contacting us with a letter like this. Dear NCSE, a member of our school board claims that something called the Hatch Amendment requires our teachers to let students opt out of instruction in evolution. Can this possibly be true? Or we'll get a letter that will say, Dear NCSE, I have a student, be from a teacher. Dear NCSE, I have a student whose father wants me to let his son opt out of instruction in evolution this semester. The principal says, let him do genetics, but I can't have the kid do Punnett squares for 4 weeks. What can I do? These are actual letters that we get seeking help from parents, from teachers, from administrators, from students, people who are facing issues of evolution and creationism in the public school classroom and turn to us for aid. Well, this Hatch Amendment is kind of an interesting thing. There is actually a Hatch Amendment, but it doesn't do what the creationists think it does. Now, if you Google Hatch Amendment, you'll very quickly come up with a letter that looks like this, kind of a form letter. This is one of the first hits that comes up on an EV search for Hatch Amendment. And this form letter says, dear so-and-so, I'm a parent of such and such student who attends so-and-so. And under U.S. legislation and federal court decisions, parents have the primary responsibility, yada, yada, yada. Parents have the right to be assured that children's beliefs and moral values are not undermined by schools, ergo. Under the Hatch Amendment, I hereby request my child not be involved in any school activities or materials unless I have first reviewed them. And unless I first reviewed all the relevant materials and then given my written consent for their use. So how this is being used in a practical sense is teachers and administrators are getting this letter and saying, does this mean we have to have the parent approve every page on every textbook and every activity in the science class before? And if the parent doesn't approve for some reason, even though the parent may not be an expert in the field that's being taught, that we then have to accommodate the kid somewhere outside the classroom, maybe send them to a library or a separate room to do some other assignment. And think about this as a teacher, how much chaos this would create. You come in to do a lesson on genetics, and you say, all right, I've got the list here. Billy and Sally, you have to go to the library for your separate thing. Jane, you have to go over there for your separate thing because your parents won't allow this. But you can imagine trying to put that together as a teacher, this weird mismatch of all these different students having different things that they can and cannot learn in a public school. The good news is, this is not what the Hatch Amendment is about. Creationists misuse it in this way. There is such a thing as a Hatch Amendment. It applies really to like third-party polls. You know, some pollster wants to come into a school, then you have the right to opt out of it. It doesn't apply to curriculum. It doesn't apply to evolution. And yet, creationists use this all the time. Creationists try and pressure teachers and administrators to get their children excluded from evolution when it's taught in biology classes or elsewhere. Now, the Hatch Amendment is real. The Santorum Amendment, which is why I have in quotes, is not. This is a, quote, amendment that many of the creationists think is part of No Child Left Behind. And that it was something added on to No Child Left Behind, and which reads, where biological evolution is taught, the curriculum should help students to understand why this subject generates so much continuing controversy. This was proposed by Rick Santorum. Now, it's not part of No Child Left Behind. It is part of what's called a conference report that was created as we have a House version and we have a Senate version. They get representatives to sit down and hash out in any sort of law the differences. And there's a report generated on what they did to overcome those differences and have one bill to give to the president. This is what happens with every piece of legislation that makes it forward into law. This Santorum Amendment was included as part of that process. It's not part of the law, but because it's in the official documents that way, the creationists point to this and say, aha, you have to show, whenever biological evolution is taught, why this generates so much controversy, and to a creationist, that means bringing in creationist attacks on evolution. So we see the Hatch Amendment, we see the Santorum Amendment. These are the sorts of tactics that creationists are using this very day in public schools. Now, speaking of legislation, there's so much going on in creationism these days. I kind of had a hard time to figure out what it was I would talk to you about, but kind of go on the more legislative side. So one really hot item right now in terms of what the creationists are trying to do to attack evolution is to promote what are called academic freedom bills. These are pieces of legislation at the state level that have written into them attacks on evolution and a way to undermine science education itself. Now these academic freedom bills, I mean, it's kind of an Orwellian name. Who could be against academic freedom? Isn't that part of what schools are about? It sounds so nice, but some of the language of this shows more the actual purpose. It's not about academic freedom in the broadest sense. It's about attacking evolution. Now in 2008, Louisiana became the first state to pass one of these so-called academic freedom bills. And it specifies that in the state of Louisiana, there will be special protection for teachers who want to talk about the problems with evolution, the origins of life, global warming, and human cloning. Human cloning? They talk about that in high school? I don't think so. That's not really a scientific topic. It's never really been done. Likewise, the origins of life. We don't really talk too much about that in the high school biology class. Maybe a paragraph on the Stanley Miller experiments. There's not a lot there. So the real targets buried in this are evolution and climate change, which they call global warming. And that is, of course, the two things that NCSE, my organization, is devoted to defending. So this is actually law in Louisiana. It became law in 2008. And since then, there's been at least one major science organization that pulled out a conference that was going to be held in New Orleans. There are others that have been held, but it's often that you arrange these things years in advance and you can't contractually pull out of them. I suspect in the future, New Orleans is going to get fewer and fewer science organizations wishing to visit and spend money in a state that promotes such anti-science legislation. Now, if you want to read the text of all of these academic freedom bills, you can find a model for it on this site, academicfreedompetition.com. And I love the way this site looks. It's put together, in a way that almost looks like a parody of hyper-patriotism. It's got the Liberty Bell, and it's got the flag, and it's got the Constitution. It's, oh, who can be against this, right? This seems so patriotic and so good. Signing the academic freedom petition. It's got all these nice things on it. But when you actually look at the details, it's a little more nefarious. For one thing, this site, Academic Freedom Petition, has model academic freedom legislation. So if you are a legislature, and we have seen this happen, you can go to this website, copy and paste what's on there into a bill that you propose in your state legislature. We've seen many that come directly from the language of this, others that come with slight modifications. The website, academicfreedompetition.com, is owned by a group called the Discovery Institute. In fact, you can see them clearly listed right here. Here's the email of one of the employees of the Discovery Institute. This is an organization in Seattle that promotes what's called intelligent design creationism, which you may have heard of. Back in 2005, there was a big case involving this, which they lost. And as in part perhaps a result of that loss, they're now going to other ways that are not mentioning intelligent design, trying to come in through the back door and just slyly allow the possibility, allow the quote, academic freedom for creationist teachers to bring non-scientific attacks on evolution into the public school classroom. Now, as I mentioned, 2008, one of these so-called academic freedom bills passed in Louisiana. 2011 was a very busy year for us. We saw bills introduced in Florida, Kentucky, Missouri, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas. All those went down fairly easily. One thing that happens is we contact our members in Florida, Kentucky, Missouri, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, and we say to our NCSE members and encourage them to contact other people, especially academics, biology faculty. We have a lot of biology professors on our membership. Say, you should write an email to the people on the committee who are going to hear this bill and decide whether it goes forward, and let them know that you think this is bad science, that this is bad education, it will be very bad for your state. And that sort of feedback can be very effective, especially in these early stages to get the bill killed. Now, Tennessee, in 2011, came the closest of all of this towards becoming a piece of legislation. It passed the House handily. The governor indicated he was going to sign it. It had the votes to pass in the Senate. And then, at the very last minute, the senator who had proposed this Tennessee bill withdrew it. Now, one of the reasons he cited for this was that he needed more time to consider the objections that had been made by one of his former biology professors. So here we see a case of this direct contact with legislatures really working to let them know that what they're trying to do with these quote-unquote academic freedom bills is going to be very harmful to their state's education, very harmful to their state's reputation. Well, that was last year. We got a lot of new ones this year. Some of them are amazing. Well, let's start with Oklahoma. This is an easy one. Right now, in the Oklahoma Senate, there is SB 1742. This is a pretty standard academic freedom bill. It has that same list, right? That same list from Louisiana. Evolution, the origin of life, global warming, and human cloning. Remember when I was talking about the cutting and pasting this legislation? You really, from my perspective, you just see what happens with this over and over in the same exact language. Maybe a few variations. So, you know, it's kind of like that old joke about the prisoners who don't need to tell the same joke. They just say, joke number 4, and they all laugh. For us, it's kind of like that. You say, oh, AFA, Academic Freedom Act, number 4. Oh, that's what it is. So that one's a pretty standard academic freedom act. Missouri has a couple that are interesting. HB 1276 is one that's currently in consideration in Missouri. And this would, I'm quoting here directly from the bill's language, allow teacher academic freedom to teach scientific evidence regarding evolution. That is very strange. Why would teachers need permission from the legislature or special legal protection to teach scientific evidence regarding evolution? Isn't that what, if you're a high school biology teacher, your job is? You're supposed to teach the scientific evidence regarding evolution. But to the creationist eyes, that's not what's being taught. To their eyes, only one side, the Darwinist side, is being taught. And what they want to bring into the classroom is, quote unquote, scientific evidence. But science defined extremely broadly. Science defined not in the way that other scientists define it. I mentioned earlier that 2005 case involving intelligent design. Well, one of the proponents of intelligent design testified in this case that he, under his broad definition of science, would include astrology as part of that. That on the stand, under oath, astrology is a science. Not astronomy. He wasn't mistaken. I mean, I'm talking the tarot signs and Virgo rising, all that qualifies as science. And so what they mean by teach scientific evidence regarding evolution is not quite what you think that might mean. Another part of this, HB 1276, says we're going to have scientific weaknesses of the theory of biological. What's the theory of biological? Well, scientific weaknesses of the theory of biological and hypotheses of chemical evolution. So in a way, it'd be great if this passes, because then teachers could say, well, I can't do this because I don't know what the theory of biological is. You know what the theory of biology is, and the theory of evolution is about, but you have to go by the language of the bill. You have to go with what was actually passed. Maybe they'll admit that. Missouri HB 1277 is another bill currently in the Missouri House, and it is one of the most bizarre bills I have ever seen. It's long, about 3,000 words long. I mean, most bills are just a couple of sentences. This bill, HB 1277, redefines science. I mean, it has a glossary in the beginning of it. Here's what science means. Here's what evolution means. Here's what intelligent design means. It even goes so far as to define destiny. I mean, I really don't think we need the Missouri House to define destiny for us, because we know what that word means. And I really don't think it's up to the Missouri legislature to define what science is, or what evolution is. Aren't there scientists and evolutionary biologists who could do a much better job of that? HB 1277 tries to set a thing that it calls standard science, to require that every classroom will teach standard science. Now, this standard science isn't what practicing scientists would recognize as standard science. It is bringing in a lot of non-scientific criticisms of evolution, things that come from the creationist side, not from actual research science. It misunderstands something of the nature of science, too. Part of HB 1277 says, a theory, as in the theory of evolution, a theory shall be identified as theory. Strangely circular. Well, here again we're getting into this creationist wanting to redefine reality, wanting to create their own set of facts, because they just, gosh darn it, the facts of the world don't correspond to what they want it to be. So in their mind, theory means guess. Theory means something weak. To a scientist, of course, theory means a broad explanation that is very well supported by a lot of diverse evidence, like the theory that living things have cells. That's a theory. The theory of gravity. That's a theory. These are big, overarching explanations. So defining that theory shall be identified as theory, okay. But not if you mean theory means guess, because that's not what it means scientifically. Now, something that really struck me about HB 1277 is that it applies not only to K-12 education, which is what this sort of legislation usually involves, but also to public universities. So public universities will be required, if this passes, to teach standard science as defined by this act. Now, in addition to working at NCSE, I'm also faculty at College of Marin, right down the road here. And speaking for myself and for many of my fellow faculty, the legislature tries to tell you how to teach your class. How's that going to go over? Trying to instruct faculty, to require college faculty that they do a particular style of teaching. Well, the phrase herding cats comes to mind. It's just not going to happen. Now, HB 1277 contains some startling statements in it. One of them is, biological intelligent design shall be taught. Another is that advanced school boards may require theories concerning the origin of life, including creation science. Now, creation science has long been ruled by the Supreme Court to be a religious doctrine and hence to violate the First Amendment if enforced, if put in by force into public schools. You can't teach creation science in public schools. And that's something that the writers of this either think should be challenged in the courts. That's maybe one possible interpretation. They want this to become law. They want this to be challenged. They want this to go to the Supreme Court. And it's so obviously egregiously bad in that way that it's just sort of tailor-made for overturning that precedent. It also contains this statement, which I think of all these I find perhaps the most puzzling. Teachers shall not question, survey, or otherwise influence student belief. Exactly. What's the point of education? It's not to influence student belief. Not in a dogmatic or forceful way, but to try and make students question what they believe, try and get them to think about what they hold to be true. I mean, if I remember back to my education, it seemed like every professor that I had was trying to promote his or her point of view, and they're all mutually exclusive and contradictory. I'd have a Marxist economics professor in the morning, followed by a libertarian professor in the afternoon, and they would both insult each other and say each other was completely wrong. And I think this is important for students to experience. To have their beliefs, their thoughts, their assumptions challenged is a very important part of education. And I don't think it's harmful to have teachers go through and try and make children think about what they think. And yet this bill, HB 1277, would literally outlaw that. Now, the Granite State has a couple of bills. This has the theory thing again, requires evolution to be taught as a theory in HB 1148, but also contains this remarkable statement, that whenever in the classroom is included the theorists, and by theorists I think they mean scientists, including the theorists' political and ideological viewpoints and their position on the concept of atheism. That shall be taught in any science subject. That'll have to be mentioned as like a little amendment. So how would this go? You know, you say, okay, today class we're going to talk about the theory of evolution as first proposed by Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, initially a seminary student, dropped out of that, later some sort of vague agnostic in his life. Now let's get to what he thought. I mean, what relevance is the religious affiliation of the person you're talking about to the ideas, to the science that they have shown? I mean, when you talk about genetics, you talk about Gregor Mendel. Well, Gregor Mendel had all these ideas, but first I have to talk about the fact that he was a Catholic priest. That's the most important thing. That's what New Hampshire thinks is missing from public schools. It's really very bizarre. Now, New Hampshire, I said, is another bill, and this one I read like, HB 1457. This bill would require science teachers to instruct pupils that proper scientific inquiry results. Wait a second. Don't these guys have spell check? I really hope, I'm giving this legislation the benefit of the doubt, that this was a spelling error, a typo, and that the legislator who wrote this didn't actually think that you pronounced that word inquiry. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. But this would require science teachers to instruct pupils that proper scientific inquiry results not from committing to any one theory or hypothesis, no matter how firmly it is established, no matter what evidence you have for it. So the hypothesis that the world is best described as a sphere, an oblate spheroid, well, you have a lot of evidence from that, but we're not going to commit. No matter what evidence is ever presented. I mean, essentially it's an anti-scientific thinking bill. Part of the thing in science is requiring a lot of evidence, but part of the thing in science is also having that evidence eventually come to a point where you can say, okay, this is the way we think it is. And we think the earth has a certain shape. We think that viruses and bacteria cause disease. We think a lot of things with very well firmly established. All these theories and hypotheses are firmly established, and yet this essentially redefine what good scientific inquiry is, to contradict what scientists actually do. The sponsor of this, furthermore, explained his reasoning for putting forth this bill as well. Basically, we're teaching children that basically they're animals. Well, you're a science teacher. You kind of like imagine approaching it like Aristotle. Say, okay, well, what do we have in the world? We have mineral, vegetable, animal. So children, I guess you're vet plants now. I can't say you're animals. Virginia has an interesting bill, HB 1207. This doesn't mention evolution directly, but we think it might be used to that effect. And what Virginia House Bill HB 1207 says is that it affirms the right of students to assert conscientious objection to college degree requirements. The basis of this objection must be a sincerely held religious belief. So you're a biology student. You're a creationist biology student. Oh, believe me, there are a number. There are a number of people who pursue even PhDs in the sciences with the sort of underlying goal of saying, well, I have a doctorate, and that gives me the credibility to now attack Darwin. I mean, there are a handful of these people, but the number is not zero. So there will be students who would like to assert the right to assert conscientious objection to learning evolution if you're a biology major. Imagine that. You're going to major in biology, and one of the core classes, one of the integrating things, you take objection to. This is kind of like saying, in my field, geology, I want to study geology, but man, I'm not taking any class in plate tectonics. That offends me. It's a very strange thing. And this bill also allows for civil action. In other words, for students suing schools, suing universities that don't allow them to opt out of evolution, let's say. It also says that the state of Virginia will not recognize accrediting agencies who don't follow this. Somebody needs to explain to the Virginia legislature that that's not the way it works. It's not that Virginia recognizes the school accrediting agencies. It's the way around. The school accrediting agencies look at the program and say, is this program in this college rigorous enough? Is it up to our standards? And then we'll recognize that program. So HB 1207, very strange bill. Indiana, and this will be the last one. This is like all the last few weeks. These are all, well, I've been very busy with these for the last month. Indiana SB 89. In its original version, had this sentence, that in the state of Indiana, teachers are required the teaching of various theories concerning the origin of life, including creation science. Again, that phrase, creation science, which the Supreme Court has very, very clearly come down on and say, this is a religious concept, you can't teach it in a public school any more than you could have somebody evangelize to students as part of a science class or a social studies class. One of the sponsors of the bill actually described this as a lawyer's dream, sort of inviting suits over this, inviting lawsuits that I imagine they think will eventually lead up to the Supreme Court and will overturn the rulings that they find so odious. So this isn't a serious bill. This is a bill to create lawsuits. Now, it was amended. That language was taken out last week. And how it now reads is that students will learn theories from multiple religions, including Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Scientology. And this is how the language of SB 89 currently reads, Scientology. And with that language intact, it passed on the 31st of January, just last week, on the 28th of 22 vote. This is now, this week, possibly up for vote in the House of Indiana. So stay tuned to the newspapers. You may hear this week that Indiana has now ruled that Scientology is going to be taught in public schools. And so get ready, Tom Cruise is coming to town. I mean, Scientology has some interesting creation stories. This idea of a 75 million year old galactic tyrant named Zeno who gathers all these people called Thetans into DC-8s and flies them to volcanoes and then drops nuclear bombs in the volcanoes. And all the ghosts of these people are now infecting us humans and giving us things such as stuttering and autism and dyslexia. Tom Cruise, of course, claims that Scientology is curing dyslexia. That's what's going to be in public schools in Indiana. My word. So let's look a little deeper now. This is some of the current activity, and I should tell you this is just a fraction of the current activity that NCSE has to deal with. We also get calls from parents, from teachers, from administrators, people asking for help on specific issues in addition to the state legislation that we keep track of. A big part of the root of this problem, a big part of why in 2012 this is happening in the United States of America, you can see here. This chart, which was put together in 2005, shows the acceptance or rejection of evolution in 34 industrialized countries. The blue is accepting evolution, the red is rejecting, and the yellow is, who knows. Iceland comes in here over 85% accepting evolution. You see the UK here, quite a majority. You see Hungary, quite a majority. We're by the green arrow. This is the United States down here, second to last, with only about 40% of the public accepting evolution, and pretty much the same number rejecting evolution, and a big ground in the middle. Now, the country that's below us is Turkey. And I find that interesting, because in many ways on this issue we parallel things that happen in Turkey. We are both nominally secular states. Ataturk made Turkey a secular state by its constitution. But yet we have large and powerful fundamentalist movements in both countries that fundamentally reject this idea of separation of church and state and wish to seek to overturn that idea. So the United States seems to have more in common with Turkey in this regard than it does with the UK or Iceland. Now, rejection of evolution is only part of the problems that we have in this country. There are severe issues that we face with basic science illiteracy. Surveys show that 1 in 5 Americans, 20%, thinks that the Earth is in the center of the solar system. The sun revolves around us rather than the other way around. That's not just 1 in 100 or some, it's too many for it to be some kid just sort of being fun. Oh, I'll tell them it's the other way. No, this is, let's see, about 100 people in this room. So by these numbers, 1 out of 5 of you. Although maybe not in this audience. But the population as a whole, it's a frighteningly high number who don't know whether the sun goes around the Earth or the other way around. 63% of Americans cannot name the planet closest to the sun. And it's a startlingly basic science that is missing. It's a science illiteracy that is a function, really, of how bad our public schools have become in teaching science. 63% can't name the planet closest to the sun, but 60% can name Superman's home planet. So at least something's going right. About 41% of the population thinks that dinosaurs and people lived together at the same time. And this idea that dinosaurs and people have lived together at the same time is promoted by places such as the Creation Museum in Kentucky. Anybody ever heard of that? Anybody ever been to it? Oh, I haven't been yet either. I really want to go. Because there you will see very elaborate, very expensive dioramas of people and dinosaurs cavorting together in the Garden of Eden. And creationists are all over this dinosaur connection. I don't really know why it is they so go for dinosaurs, but they like it. They like to teach about dinosaurs and show how they're living with people. Here's this book, Tracking Those Incredible Dinosaurs and the People Who Knew Them. They point to things such as this, which is a very sort of stylized dinosaur footprint, stamped on top of a human footprint. And say this is an actual rock. This can't, it shows that Darwinism can't be right. Look, dinosaurs stomping on human footprints. Doesn't look fake at all to you, does it? I think somebody with a chisel just did that. Because I'm sure whenever you step into mud, you get the nice 5 toes all clearly defined. That's how it works. And some creationists propose even further and say that we assume dinosaurs, or scientists assume dinosaurs are extinct. Maybe they're actually still alive. There are creationists who promote this idea. And they point to, say, well, deep in the Congo, people there have the myth of a giant beast in the jungle. Well, that sounds just like a dinosaur. They use this to say maybe dinosaurs did not go extinct at all. Probably, of course, they would taste just like chicken. Now, the Creation Museum is in Kentucky. That's already built. But a new project close by is going up called Ark Encounter. This will be a full-scale Noah's Ark put together by a group called Answers in Genesis, AIG. Now, half of this talk, just last week, the governor there put forth a budget that proposed $50 million in cuts to public schools. Not just science, but across the board. In this same budget, a $43 million tax break to this religious organization, Answers in Genesis, in order to build this Ark Park. Now, the justification of this is, of course, they'll employ people there. Maybe they will. But if they employ them with the same standards that they do at their Creation Museum, each employee will have to sign a statement of faith. So they, in other words, agree with the religious mission. And if that's true here at Ark Encounter, then essentially you're having almost, the exact same amount of cuts in public schools going as a gift for these creationists, and the idea of employment being somewhat undercut, and that it will only be people who are of a certain religious persuasion. Now, that sounds bad. When I told you it was a little disheartening. Unfortunately, it gets even worse. When we look at surveys of high school biology teachers, the front line of science education, people you would think would be really up on the evolution creationism issues, what we find is that 1 in 4 high school biology teachers talks about creationism in their classroom. Now, that's not necessarily bad. I mean, I'm talking about creationism now. And when I teach, for instance, geology classes about the national parks, I talk about the creationist ideas about the national park. Not as something to learn, but as something to say, and here's why this is wrong. But of those 1 in 4 that teaches creationism, 1 in 8, or discusses creationism, 1 in 8 teaches creationism. 1 in 8 high school biology teachers teaches creationism as part of his or her course. And 6 in 10 teachers, overall, 6 in 10 describe themselves as cautious about teaching evolution. In other words, they don't teach evolution as they would if they didn't have this fear of the community, fear of angry responses from parents, fear of lack of support from their administration. This hostile environment towards the teaching of evolution is, by the numbers, the biggest problem here happening in high school biology classes. Not, this is bad enough, but this is worse, that 60% of high school biology teachers are afraid to teach evolution. Now, how do they know there's a hostile environment towards evolution? Drive around. Drive around and you see cars like this. Somebody has taken the time to paint on their hood here, evolution. The fossils say, no, no. Do you think that affects the resale value of the car? Yeah.
Those data that you just put up, is that for California,
No,
nationally?
that would be nationally.
Nationally.
Yeah, nationally.
How do you know 1 in 6 are this or 1 in 4 are that? How do you know that?
It was surveyed by 2 researchers in Berkman and Plutzer, who have written a book on this and a number of articles. They essentially just go out and survey high school biology teachers. And these are the responses they get back. So, evolution, a fairy tale for grown-ups. There's this kind of hostility. You can't but drive around and see this sort of thing. You drive around and see billboards. Evolution is science fiction. Evolution is a lie. Evolution is from the devil. They pay their own money to make a billboard and put this. These are not cheap. Right? So these are people who are really, really motivated to attack evolution. And gosh, have you ever seen a billboard attacking business? The equation force equals mass times acceleration is from the devil. You don't see that with physics. You don't see Avogadro's number is a hoax for chemistry. It's just evolution that really gets it. Now, to understand what's going on here, to understand why there's so much hostility, why we have this very aggressively anti-evolution strain in our country, I think you can understand a lot of that from this picture. This is a picture done by an artist who I really recommend you check out his site here, but notanart.com. He has a couple of these. They're really sort of interesting. I thought about actually getting them for my apartment. It would be an interesting conversation piece. But this one in particular has something to say for us. Here we see in the front is under Jesus delivering the Constitution. Now, one of his more recent paintings actually has Barack Obama stepping on the Constitution. But anyway, Jesus delivering the Constitution. And we see over here on the right hand of Jesus, and I should say when you go to the website here and hover over these figures, it explains what each means to the artist. This is completely didactic, lacking any subtlety of metaphors. This person represents this. Anyway, we have the school teacher, the serviceman, the college student, the pastor. These are, on the right hand of Jesus, the good side of America. And then we have in the background all the founding fathers. We have Benjamin Franklin and Christa McAuliffe and James Madison and George Washington, Lincoln, all the good folk. Is Nixon there? I don't see Nixon. Anyway, it would be funny to put it. And all these people are looking towards the figures on the left-hand side of Jesus. On the left-hand side of Jesus is everything that's wrong with America. We have those judges. Ooh, those judges who took prayer out of school. Those judges that let school integrate. Oops, I'm sorry, that's the older attacks on the courts. They don't say that anymore. But you're old enough to remember that they certainly did at one time, that attacks on judges. But now there's a little prayer going out of school. We have the unwed pregnant mother. Oh, that can't be good. We have the media report, that liberal media. The businessman who's too busy on his phone to even notice what's going on. The Hollywood producer, and faintly there, right? You may be able to see Satan whispering in the ear of the Hollywood producer. Which, I don't know, considering some of the movies that are out there, maybe there's something to this. Say, hey, you ought to take the Phantom Menace and make a 3D version of that. Yes, that's a great idea. But there's one figure here that sits higher than all the others. One figure who imagines himself on the same level as Jesus. And I'm describing this just as the website describes this. This is the worst figure of all in what's wrong with America. The professor. The intellectual. The PhD. This person who uses his tenured position to corrupt the minds of young people, things like Darwinism and climate change and almost science itself. And this tenured professor, the person who's responsible more than anyone else for what's wrong with America in this, is holding a book. What book do you think it is? Yeah, you got it exactly right. Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, or On the Origin of Species is the actual title. The tenured professor is the thing that's really bringing down this country, according to this. And this is what this artist sincerely believes. I have no doubt that in painting these grand paintings, he's really espousing a certain worldview, a worldview which many, many people share. Many people think of evolution as the root of all evil. They see evolution as the trunk of the tree of all these bad things. We have abortion and humanism, and racism and euthanasia, sexual perversion and uniformitarianism. What is uniformitarianism? It's a basic geologic idea. So for me as a geologist, like, uniformitarianism. Well, uniformitarianism helps you understand an old Earth. See, an Earth older than 10,000 years. We see Nazism as one of the roots here. And if we cut down evolution, we get rid of all these problems. Because, we never had any racism before 1859, when Darwin published The Origin of Species. That only came into existence after that time. The Nazism thing is one they very often cite. Here's a movie. Did anybody ever hear about this or see this? Yeah, that's about how it sold tickets. This came out a few years back by a fellow named Ben Stein, who's a television personality, very sort of droll voice. And he made this movie, I won't say documentary, maybe fake-umentary, called Expelled, about intelligent design. The thesis of this movie was that academics who present ideas of intelligent design creationism are being discriminated against in universities. That those tenured professors are trying to to keep people from knowing the truth about Darwinism. Now, one place this film went, and went in a very bad way, was to connect Darwin to Hitler, trying to make a direct connection there. At one point, Ben Stein is sitting on the railroad tracks leading into Dachau, crying. And it's really distastefully done, so much so that the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, issued a terse statement condemning this film's misuse of Holocaust imagery to promote an anti-scientific view. And by anti-scientific, I'm quite serious that this film hates science. Ben Stein, in fact, in the later interview, tagged in with the release of this film, had this remarkable sentence. He said, "Science leads you to killing people." That's really what he thinks. Science, all of science, is murderous in its final outcome. He's not alone in thinking this. Now, if any of you have seen this film, NCSC, one of the things we did was put together a website called Expelled Exposed, which basically goes over every line of this film and explains why every line is wrong, why the academics they claim were expelled from the university, in fact, weren't, and so on. We were very happily able to launch this website the same day this film released. So we thought it was a good countermeasure, and that's some of the things that NCSC does to help defend evolution. This is a book by a professor at CSU Stanislaw, who's a professor of history, one of those tenured history professors, and also a fellow of the Discovery Institute. Remember I mentioned that intelligent design group up in Seattle. And he's put out two books, which sort of in a dry academic way try and link Darwin with Hitler. Hitler's Ethic, the Nazi pursuit of evolutionary progress. We have books that are a little more extreme. I like this one. This is a Turkish creationist group called Harun Yahya. And here we see a statue of Darwin. And on the pedestal is Franco and Mussolini and Hitler. There's blood, you know, it's really? That's so over the top that it almost seems like it should be a mockery. But they're dead serious about this. So, I'm giving you a range of the things that are happening in terms of anti-evolution activity. I'm giving you a range of what's happening legislatively, culturally. Let's talk about some solutions. Now, one thing that NCSC tries to promote to science teachers is to ignore the order of chapters in your textbook as you're teaching. Because most textbooks are constructed this way. This is a very good textbook, but the chapter on evolution is 959 pages into the work. Put evolution first. Evolution is the defining theory that integrates all of biology, that explains why we have the diversity of species on planet Earth. It's that important. It's like trying to teach geology without plate tectonics. It's like trying to understand medicine without cell theory. Teaching evolution first is a way textbooks should be structured, but tend not to be. And teaching evolution as a discrete chapter also means that creationist teachers will put that at the end. This is almost at the end, almost at the appendices. They'll put this at the end and then say, oh, well, we didn't have time with that, let's just watch a movie. How about Expelled? Really, this is what's happening. We get a showing of Expelled instead of the chapter on evolution, because it's at the end and it's easy to skip. Put it first and it won't be so easy to skip. Evolution should be presented in science classrooms as a unifying principle, and not just one chapter. And here we see another book, a very, very fine textbook, which has a unit on evolution here, talks about the history of life, talks about natural selection and all. This is in about 400 pages in, chapter 18. And yet apparently, if we go through an order, students have already talked about DNA, they've already talked about human heredity, they've talked about patterns of heredity, genetics. Over here they're going to talk about fungi and protists. How are they going to know how fungi and protists are related to each other? How are they going to know why the common features, and there are a lot of common features that fungi and protists have. How are they going to know how those fit together? Evolution is the explanation. To make evolution part of every chapter, part of human heredity, part of genetics, and all can be integrated into that. And that will solve the problem of having a creationist teacher say, well, I'll just skip that chapter. No, just skip the whole book. This will help solve the problem of a parent saying, I'd like little Jimmy to not have that chapter on evolution. I want to opt out of that for the Hatch Amendment. Say, well, I'm sorry, you can't opt out of the entire class. We should also promote the idea that there is a false choice being presented by creationists. There's a false choice that one must either choose the side of Jesus or the side of Darwin, and that there are internal conflict. Wow, this is a rather aggressive picture. I never quite got that impression of the guy being that violent. Well, Jesus and Darwin fighting again. But in truth, there are a lot of scientists, very prominent scientists, who are also very prominent people of faith, who see no contradiction between their faith and the science. And we should let students know about that whenever creationists try and say, well, tell me which side you're going to pick, Jesus or the evil Darwin. The choice is false, and we should identify it as such. We should also not allow the creationists to take over words such as theory. Everybody misunderstands theory, misuses that theory to mean a guess. And it doesn't mean a guess. Being called a theory is a compliment. Being called the theory of gravity doesn't mean that gravity is weak or poorly understood. It means it's well understood. Likewise with evolution, the theory of evolution doesn't mean it's a guess. It means it's something to be, that is supported by a lot of evidence and should be taught. Now, a great site that I like to point a lot of people to on this point, on understanding theory, hypothesis, law. These are confusing terms. I even know some college professors who get these wrong on occasion. Emphasizing the nature of science and how science works, science as a process rather than a list of things to memorize, is a thing that needs to be emphasized in our schools and will help students with their literacy. Berkeley, my alma mater, has put together a great site of understanding science. unsi.berkeley.edu is run at the UC Berkeley Museum of Paleontology, a great institution for promoting evolution and science. And unsi.berkeley.edu is a great place to point people to when they have questions about, well, isn't that just a theory? I just give them that web address. Say, look here, it will explain everything. And so, we leave you with this thought, that with the attacks on evolution that we've seen, what is needed is eternal vigilance for both democracies and squirrels, both democracies and science. Eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. Thank you very much.
Newton, first of all, I think if we make kosher the dinosaur's leg, it will be more acceptable. But my question is, what is the status regarding Muslims? They have a problem with evolution. I have no idea.
Well, there's a huge variety of thinking in the Muslim faith. I mean, just the split between Shia and Sunni is one example. So there are some Muslims, especially in Turkey, I mentioned that group Harun Yahya, which have a very anti-evolution bent, which really reject evolution and support more of a young earth creationist view. And a lot of European countries have experienced this, they've experienced an influx of immigrants. Those immigrants have brought with them many of those views, which are now being addressed in public schools in France and Great Britain. It's something that is increasingly becoming an international problem, not just the United States. So I would say that just as there's a variety of faiths in America, some of which are hostile towards evolution and some of which are absolutely not, it's the same with Islam.
Several years ago, I heard a debate on the radio between a professor, doctor of philosophy, who was on the creationist side, against Professor Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard.
It's one of our, the late Stephen Jay Gould, but one of our supporters.
Yeah, he died a few years ago. And one of the outstanding remarks made by the doctor of philosophy was that the Grand Canyon was created over a period of about 6 months by the same flood that floated Noah.
Yeah.
One other point, would you care to comment on the voucher problem, which is most of the people who promote creationism are also pushing vouchers?
Yeah, well, NCSE doesn't have a real position on the voucher issue. That's a bit out of our domain, but the attacks on public education are in many ways not just limited to evolution. They're an attack on the institution of public education itself. And so, broadly, I think everyone should support the idea of public education and fix its obvious problems. And we've seen some of those problems here. Whether vouchers are a solution or not, we don't have any, NCSE doesn't have any position on that. But promoting and defending public education, I think, is something everyone should have as a worthwhile goal.
Many scientists regard evolution as a fact. The theory that explains it is the theory of natural selection.
It's one way to look at it. Here again, we get in the terminological problem. We mean fact to be something that's true. And scientists would certainly say evolution is true. Theory is, of course, this broader idea. A problem with equating evolution just as a theory of natural selection is that modern evolution also includes things such as genetics. Darwin didn't know anything about genetics. It's kind of remarkable that he came up with what he did with never having heard the words DNA. So modern evolution is broader than just natural selection, including all sorts of population genetics and biogeography and such.
I was wondering if a credible poll has been taken that would show what percentage of, say, Americans would really be opposed to evolution and move against it?
Well, I think the poll I cited earlier is 40% have a problem in accepting evolution. 40% do not accept evolution. By moving against it, you mean in some sort of more activist way?
Yeah.
If that's in a more activist way, I assume that would be some fraction of that 40%. There's always going to be a lot of inertia. I mean, there's a lot of biology professors who've never testified before their local school board when the school board is trying to remove evolution. And we at NCSE, one of the things we do is try and put those two together, done by those professors, with a thing that needs to happen at their local school board. And it takes a little bit of a bump to get people to go out on a Wednesday night to the city council chambers and testify or something like that. It does take a little bit of action to stir people into action.
Hello. If evolution is so accepted as unquestioned,
if evolution is so accepted as unquestioned fact, how do you account for the fact that so many of the leading evolutionary scientists in the last 25 and 30 years have made verifiable statements to the effect that evolution was impossible? Well, including Dr. Stephen Jay Gould, the co-inventor of punctuated equilibrium.
Well, would you repeat the first part of the question?
If evolution is so accepted as unquestioned fact,
yeah.
How do you account for the fact that so many scientists have made verifiable statements that it was impossible, but they're going to teach it anyway?
Well, I think the real problem here is the phrase unquestioned fact. I don't think any idea in science, especially the big, broad ideas like evolution or plate tectonics, is an unquestionable thing. Part of the nature of science is for every idea, and especially the most important ideas, to be constantly questioned, to be constantly assumed to be wrong until evidence shows otherwise. So we shouldn't take from it that some scientists are trying to show that evolution is wrong. We shouldn't take from that evolution therefore is wrong. It's rather the process of science that challenges, provides evidence, and judges again and again. And even the most esteemed scientists, if you're going to get a paper published in Nature or Science, you really have to have the evidence. Your name is not enough. And that's a part of a cultural skepticism that science has. Did Stephen Jay Gould question aspects of evolution? Absolutely. And you mentioned punctuated equilibrium, this idea that he came up with together with Niles Eldredge, which was a very important and very useful modification to the idea of gradualism. And Darwin conceived in his vantage point from 1859, of evolution happening by minor, small modifications steadily over a long time. We know from Stephen Jay Gould and Alex Eldridge that instead of a nice gradual curve, when you actually look at the morphology of, let's say, shells and how they evolve, it looks more like steps. Sudden changes, flat points. Sudden state changes, flat points. That's how the fossil record actually shows. That's the idea of punctuated equilibrium. Equilibrium being more or less the same, and we do see species that don't change for a long time. And then rapid changes when something spurs them, like a new predator or a changing environment. There was a long answer to that.
Could you mention the position on climate change?
With my organization?
Yes.
Well, just as with evolution, we want to promote the most widely accepted scientific ideas. Our position is in accordance with the IPCC and other scientific groups, which see climate change as real, as being documented in terms of weather changes that are happening now, and also because, especially with chemical evidence through carbon dioxide, that we can see coming from anthropogenic or human resources. The IPCC, in its last report, was very clear about this. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is an organization of roughly 600 of the best climate scientists in the world who get together and write a report that synthesizes the state of knowledge. And they won the Nobel Prize for this back in 2007. The IPCC has, over its course of its history, evolved from initially, some of their first reports were saying, well, we think there may be changes, and we think these changes may be human caused. And they have evolved their position to, in their last report, being, well, the evidence is conclusive, we know it's happening, and we know it's us. It's time to now deal with remediation, with what we can do about it. So I would say that that's the position that we're taking in accordance with the IPCC, and therefore in accordance with the vast majority, 99%, of climate scientists. Not 100%. There are people who challenge this, and we welcome challenge in science.
Has there been any legislation introduced in California that might duplicate the legislation that you illustrated on the board from Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, and so forth? And if I may ask another question, has the legislation in these various states produced results in the sense that there have been trials or lawsuits or money or teachers fired and so forth? Thank you.
Well, I guess as a native Californian, I'm embarrassed to say that our state legislature can't do anything. So there probably are some members of the California state legislature who would want to promote such bills, but California is not a place that would typically have issues with this. In fact, California's science standards, the kind of the basis of what tells teachers this class should teach this, and the basis of what textbook makers should be in textbooks for these particular courses. California's science standards are consistently rated among the best in the country, especially in terms of climate change and evolution. And they mention human evolution, that's a big one. Some states, they'll talk about evolution in a general sense, but not, say, human evolution. So California is really good in that regard, and we don't tend to have legislation come up. That being said, NCSE works with people throughout the country, and we've had a number of what we call flare-ups. Incidents where somebody emails us or calls us and says, help. I'm a teacher in such and such school, I'm getting this feedback from a parent who's really angry, my principal's not giving me any support, what do I do? That's the kind of bread and butter stuff that we do in helping, and we get a lot of those right here in the Bay Area. So we are not immune from this anywhere. Now the second part of your question in terms of has there been any legal ramifications from this, most of the bills I showed you, most of the bills here will go down in flames. Most of them will not even make it out of committee. And that's because, with the exception of Louisiana in 2008, where one of these academic freedom bills actually did become law, there are reasonable, even if conservative, senators and representatives in all 50 states who look at this and say, man, I might challenge this Darwinism thing, but this is a crazy bill. This is not good for us. This is not good for education. And we don't want to bring the shame upon our state of having employers say, well, Louisiana students, am I going to hire a Louisiana grad? Have they had evolution, or are they being taught that intelligent design? I mean, that's the kind of thing that happens to your state when you pass these bills. And so I think there are people all across the political spectrum who realize these are very bad ideas, and hence they tend to die in the committee.
I have a few things I can toss into this in response to the last question about legality and so on. There is an organization which is, in a way, sort of covering part of the arguments that you espouse, but it does it from a different point of view. It's called Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, and it's been around since 1947. And they are constantly fighting legal battles with all of these states that you talk about, because many of them get sort of in under the tent, so to speak, and they get the nose under the tent, and they do a lot of the things that we're trying to prevent before the legal beagles get in there. And anybody who would like to get a hold of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, it's at au.org, and they're really great. Anyway, I have a couple of other thoughts too.
If I could, I might second that. We work a lot with AU and Americans United, like the ACLU is a wonderful organization for legal advice, and we also refer people who have these flare problems to AU and ACLU if it should not be resolved at an earlier level. They are indeed great.
The other thought, I mean, there's all kinds of thoughts I have, and I think you've done a wonderful job, and I applaud you for that. I'm always amused at how people who are anti-science want to teach creation science, okay? And we have the Church of Christ scientists, and we have Scientology, none of which are science-based or interested in science at all. But they all want to wrap themselves in the guise of science. And as, you know, the religious movements are not going to go away. I mean, this problem is not going away soon. And oftentimes I'm trying to think, well, how would I define religion? And my conclusion after looking at it for decades is it's anything you want it to be. The Catholic Church approves of evolution, okay? So there's a huge force of people, they've thought about it, and they've said, hey, it's real, it happens, okay? It's happening all around us as antibiotics no longer work for certain bacteria. And the other thought that I have, and it goes back in a sense to the Catholic Church, is they are vociferously against abortion of any kind. But I have asked many people of that faith again and again how it is that 40 to 90% of all conceptions are aborted by miscarriage. Is some higher power deciding that that's okay that way? Anyway, that's my thought.
Well, AU, as you mentioned, Americans United is a wonderful organization, and if you're thinking I should support some of those nonprofits like NCSE, I would put AU in that as well. And the ACLU, a great organization. NCSE was not going to wait to the abortion issue. We got enough.
Hello, would you share with us your hope for human activity changing soon enough to avert global warming, climate change? Are you hopeful that we can do it?
Am I hopeful that we can do it? Well, I guess the hesitation is a no. I think there are technological things that could very much help with this, but that they're not going to be done. And for one word, Fukushima. And there is a way to produce electricity with very little carbon output, but people are so afraid of this now, and perhaps with good reason, that we're going to continue to produce electricity through coal, which is one of the worst ways to produce it. China is continuing to produce electricity through coal. And you know, I'm sure what will happen is somewhere in between my hopes and my pessimism. There will be something that is not as bad as I think it will be, and yet not as good as I would have hoped it would be. We'll see a warmer world, but it'll happen over centuries and decades, and we'll simply adapt to it. The Dutch will build higher and higher levees to keep the sea out. We can build levees here in the Bay Area to keep the sea out. People are remarkably adaptive if given a little bit of time. A problem with climate change is that one thing we know about the Earth's climate from ice core data. Now, I'm a geologist, so I'm only into the idea of these measurements of past climate through various means. What we know is that there have been huge climate swings, much, much bigger than anything we've seen, happening on the scale of decades. Way before humans were doing anything, there were these wild shifts in climate. And so that's frightening. If those wild shifts which happened before us become worse or exacerbated by what we're doing, we could be in for a change that happens beyond our ability to adapt. And I'd say it's that really worries me. I'm not worried in the long run about us being able to adapt, but in the short term, Greenland really starts disintegrating, and all that ice on land goes into the sea. One estimate here of Greenland breaking up. If that were to happen more rapidly than it is now, and it is accelerating very rapidly, we'd get 20 feet of sea level rise. Now, I live in Alameda, at about 20 feet of sea level. So, the idea of my current living place being underwater, that would be a jolt. But by the time that happens, it'll also be too late to do anything about it for centuries. I mean, the effects of the CO2 will go on and on. It's sort of like you put a lot of speed into a car and it has a lot of momentum and it's going to keep on going, even when you apply the brakes.
I think the founding fathers probably are turning over in their graves with that painting. I think at best weren't they deists, if that.
I hear them often described that way.
Yeah, and they worked so hard to separate church and state. I mean,
I don't know if Jefferson was in that painting, but Jefferson, of course, had a Bible that he edited. He created his own version, and the Texas State School Board, after their science divisions, science revisions, the next year they did social studies and history. One of the things was they de-emphasized the amount that Thomas Jefferson is included. And some people thought maybe that's because he was a deist and because he made his own version of the Bible, which is sort of sacrilegious to some. I really wonder on a lot of issues, I'm sure we all do, what the founding fathers would really think. If there could be a time machine, boy, would they be surprised.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about scientific method. I grew up in Nauvoo where there was a lot of science. And, I don't know where I picked up my learning of scientific method, but I don't think it was in the schools. And it seems like that part of our issue here is helping people to understand how you know things, ways of learning, and not just theory, but why one is a scientific method kind of theory and one is an article of faith. Do you work with that at all in the education system?
Yes, very much so. I think what you're describing, the fact that you can go through a very complete education and not get any sense of the scientific method, is a real flaw. I mean, you can't go through public high school in America and not learn the rules of baseball or football, but you can certainly go through and not learn the rules of science or the process of science. And I would say that it's a flaw that's especially true in science education itself. Nowhere do you get sat down and said, this is how science works, these are the important points, these are the strengths, these are the things that are wrong with it, that this is the process. You just sort of assume that you'll get it by osmosis. And that's, I think, a poor way to teach something as important as the nature of science. Now, the website I mentioned earlier, the Understanding Science site that Berkeley has put together, is, I think, a great tool in that direction. It has a lot of sort of basic stuff, so third graders can read it. There's a lot of advanced stuff, so people who already are scientists can say, oh, right, yeah, that's the difference between a theory and a hypothesis. Now I get it. Because nowhere else in your education do you really have a chance to get that material in that way. It's just assumed you'll somehow pick it up, and pick it up poorly, some people do.
Yeah, just at the very end, when you're showing that picture of Jesus Christ, can you bring it up now? I think I saw Lincoln, and he was on his hands and knees, probably imploring forgiveness, I believe, probably for emancipating slaves.
Oh, I don't know.
I'd
That's what
be
the artist
interested in his
intended.
comment.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's what the artist was intending, but, you know, you can go to the site here with Bound Art and hover over these, and it will explain what each one means. I mean, literally, even the ones in the back that you can barely see. This artist, you hover over the flag, and it says, I painted the flag dark to show that we're in dark times in this country. Okay, we get it, it's a metaphor.
Any other questions? Steve, thanks so much for such a great presentation.